So welcome everybody. This is deliberately a really informal setting. Didn't really want it in a stage environment with a row of chairs and people not able to feel relaxed enough to properly interact, because this session isn't about us talking at you, it's just as much you being able to ask questions and make points yourselves. So very much welcome your interaction with this. I do have a microphone in there, although the room's probably small enough for us to speak. But if you do want to say something, put your hand up, because also this session is being recorded, and so it'll be useful for anyone listening back to actually hear the questions. If I don't think we've picked it up, I might repeat your question, so whoever's going to answer it, it's noticed and recorded as a result. So welcome everybody. I guess the big thing here from our perspective is as practitioners in what we do, a lot of what we do is about less direct to the consumer themselves and actually more about B2B to C, and understanding that flow of how our business works, especially in content management and delivery, is going to be important. And I'm delighted to say we've got some fantastic experts with me here today who all span various different experiences and expertise in this. So hopefully within the room we got quite a lot covered. So we've got Matt, we've got Simon, we've got Janis, and we've got Heidi. And very quickly what I'd like to do is, if you don't mind, just go along and introduce yourselves. That would be awesome. Matt?
Yes, I'm Matt. After a few years at IMG and Formula E, where my last role was developing and leading all of their post-production needs. So how editors can edit all of the footage in the most effective and efficient way. I've since left Formula E to consult freelance for other companies to try and do the same thing, mainly using sort of cloud efficiencies and optimizations.
I'm Simon Wocka. I'm a senior account manager at Pixit, and we provide storage solutions for the industry, broad depths and various different verticals. But ultimately, we integrate with a lot of different third-party vendors, and MAMs in particular. Having your assets in various different places is something that's come up quite a bit, and so that's what I'm going to be sharing today.
My name is Janis. I'm the head of product and engineering for NAP MediaBank Cloud SaaS MAM product. We work with a lot of large leagues and organizations across the world to support their media asset management needs and content distribution to the different right buyers. So I'm representing the MediaBank and the MAM part of the conversation today.
And hi, I'm Heidi Shakespeare. I'm the CEO of Memnon Archiving Services. We're essentially at the start of the supply chain. So we take those physical archives and we turn them into content libraries for monetization and exploitation. So essentially we are the gatekeeper at the start of that chain of the archive process.
Brilliant, thank you. And for those who don't know me, Shane Warden. So my background is originally in editing and post-production, but then I was part of the team that built IMG Stockley Park. I created the IMG Sports Video Archive, the commercial-facing arm of that, representing Wimbledon, the RNA, and a lot of the biggest of IMG's customers and clients. I then moved to become CTO of ATP Media, where in addition to all the other things I did was the content management side of ATP Media. And then I moved from there to AWS, where I was involved with a lot of media supply chain migrations and discussions with leagues, federations, and governing bodies about how the future was going to change and where cloud comes into play and all of those things. And I've joined Monks now, which systems integrator, but one that's actually, oddly enough, linked very heavily into the world of agency and advertising. So that's a sort of technology SI business, but with direct line of sight through to brands and advertisers, which, as we all know, is ultimately where a lot of the money that we thrive on comes from. So I guess as in general, if I was going to reduce everything we do from everyone in this building, we make stuff, we move stuff, and we store stuff. There we go. That's the end of the session. No, that is ultimately basically what we do. And today we're focusing on the store stuff, but we have practitioners here who do understand the fact that we do make stuff. We take stuff out of storage, we make stuff with it, we then have to move it, and we might store it again in somewhere else. So understanding the whole of the media life cycle and metadata is very much part and parcel of of what we're going to be uncovering today. As I say, feel free at any time to put your hand up. But your turn to put your hand up first, and this is the only level of hardcore interaction that I need from you. In the room, can anyone put their hand up who actually currently manages content? Okay, great. Of those people, keep your hands up, how many of those have inherited that job, that content that they're now having to manage? Did anyone start from greenfield and build it from scratch with no other? No. And so everyone here has pretty much inherited, I wouldn't say a problem, because often it can be a nice problem, but everyone has inherited systems that they're now running and managing, and we're all trying to do something with. And I think all in this room, I think sometimes you kind of feel if I could start all over again, it would be quite a good place to be. But it isn't. And this is the crux of what I've certainly discovered in and around talking to people, is how that problem gets solved ultimately in transforming the way you're managing your media now and the legacy formats that you've had. Now, legacy is quite an interesting thing here too, because how many of you who had your hands up would describe yourselves as also the custodians of the heritage of the sport and the product that you represent? Because I think that starts to drive an interesting, different part of the conversation when we come to preservation and heritage. And that moves me into what I like to talk about first, right at the very beginning of what we do. Because understanding the challenges of migrating legacy asset management systems is all very much part of this. Because yes, we might be sitting on active systems that have got file-based content in it, and we think we know where it is, and we've got some level of metadata and tagging associated with it. But just like at my mum's house in the loft, there's something that frightens the hell out of me, and there's a ton of boxes and black bags that I have no idea what it is, and I have no idea if any of it's valuable or not. So actually, how do I understand that, and how do I move forward? Now, we're really lucky today to be here with Heidi. Heidi's just come in by private jet from...
I work in archiving, there's no private jets, I promise you.
We're all in the same place here. Just had to walk from Rome to here. But you were there at the Fiat conference just now, and it would be great to understand some of your takeaways from that conference that you've just attended.
So the Fiat IFTA conference is essentially, it's a global conference for content owners both in the heritage space but also in the commercial space. And I think one of the resounding sort of takeaways and the thing that kept repeating throughout the conference was archives on physical carriers are a cost. They sit below the line on a P&L. Once you've digitized that content, it becomes a business enabler, and it moves into that opportunity part of the business. The other challenge is that there is vastly more content in the world sitting on physical carriers than there are machines and head hours that will be able to retain that content. So the numbers that were being thrown around were, there was a UNESCO report published about 15 years ago that had 2025 as the drop dead date for being able to migrate legacy content from physical tape carriers. That has probably got an extra 2 to 3 years on it. But from what we've seen in our pipeline of clients that have come to us with content, we're currently looking at over 120 petabytes of content to be migrated. Now, currently, our largest facility can migrate around 37,000 hours a month. If we were to have that content approved, running all of our facilities at maximum capacity for the next 10 years, it would not be completed because it has to be done in real time. And there is just not the head hours or the technology or the engineers that can maintain those machines to actually be able to sustain it in 10 years' time. So a lot of the conversations were around, if you're currently paying to store your physical archive in a warehouse, if your intention is not to digitize that, then cut your losses now and destroy those tapes. Actually start to take that money that you're spending there and turn it into activating your archive to move it from being below the line on the P&L to above the line and to be able to utilize it. And you have to see that digitization process as part of the curation, because to Shane's point, especially if you've inherited archives through acquisitions and mergers and all those sorts of things, a lot of the time you don't know everything that's in your archive. And you've inherited databases, apologies, I'm Australia, I'm trying to say data, but I just can't do it. But you've inherited databases that are inconsistent and that don't necessarily give you all the information you need. Therefore, there is this reluctance of somewhere in there's going to be this gold nugget. But actually, if you don't digitize it, then you're never going to be able to activate it. And if you try to actually access it, if you sit there and go, I'll do it in 10 years' time when we can, there's not going to be the solution. It's never going to be cheaper to digitise a tape tomorrow than it was yesterday. That's the reality. And you're now joining the queue behind all those projects that are already in flow to be able to get your content digitised. So that was essentially the big sort of topic that we were talking about.
Do you have anything uplifting to tell us?
Yeah, content's also never been more valuable. There's never been more opportunities to actually activate that content and turn it into a revenue stream. So again, all of the evolutions of technology have actually made those archives into libraries that have value attached to them. So the problem is, until it's actually digitised, until you've gone through that first phase, you are missing all of those opportunities to activate that content.
So that's a really good point, and I think many of us have been in the room when we're talking to CFOs or trying to budget, and my goodness, I've been there a number of times where you're sat there. Archive is always at the bottom of the agenda, no matter what the meeting is, and you run out of time, and can we do this next time? And B, the attitude towards archive is entirely a cost, right? And if even with the commercial archive, you're washing its face, that's kind of fine. But what you're doing with all the heritage and preservation stuff that you really want to take a look at, because you personally think it's important, becomes a real challenge. And one trick I learned very early on, I deployed this, was when I realized this was starting to happen, and I'd already done a migration with Heidi in her former role when I was at IMG, but the lesson I brought from that was to be able to go to the CEO and the CFO at the time, and I wrote them an email and basically said, I understand the budgetary constraints about what we're doing, but therefore can I just have your reply to this email that you, as the C-suite leadership of this business, are prepared to write this material off such that it will never ever be seen again, it'll be destroyed. And therefore we have to be conscious that could be a conversation you might have to have at some point in the future with shareholders or stakeholders in this. So please can have your signature here now. Oh my God, did that change the conversation, right? Suddenly there was a lot to do with actually, okay, what do you mean? How can we do this? Can we pick and choose? And at last, archive moved up the agenda. So don't be afraid to do that, because it's important, because this is real, right? The companies that have made those video heads, stop making them. There is very limited supply. You won't find a VT on eBay at the moment, ever, because there's all sorts of people who have bought them all up in preparation for this now. So,
but if anybody does have any VTRs sitting in their garages or in their sheds anywhere, please come and see me, because we are constantly on the lookout. And I think the other point in regards to that, the content, you just have to have a look at the YouTube presentation this morning, or have a look at Netflix. The number of archive-led programming that's coming out at the moment is unfathomable. And the cost to produce that archive program versus a net new program is complete, they're so diametrically opposed. So again, it's also a relatively low cost for a customer engagement, viewer engagement, to add value with all of those sidecar programmings that people can watch on multi-screens when they want to go back and do that fan engagement or look back onto stats and things. That content then has a value.
Great. Guys, anything else to add?
I think that's wrapped it up, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's just talk in general about the other side of it, right? We're talking about video, but what are we doing about the metadata, right? We understand metadata needs to exist. Without that, we can't really do the searching and finding. But with a lot of archives that I've had my hands on in that physical sense, they will come through with paperwork, with scribbles on the box lid, with all sorts of stuff on camera tape, which could be important, couldn't be important. When we're migrating this content, what do we do about the metadata that comes with it, if it is physical? And is that metadata we should be relying on in a future state? So,
yeah,
Janis?
As we know, the metadata is the backbone of any archive. So in this situation where you have a large video library, it's very important to take care of the data you are receiving together with those assets. We, based on our experience from the different projects, have seen a lot of messy metadata around the market. There is a lot of unreliable metadata. It comes from different sources. It's with a lot of metadata inconsistencies when it comes down to schemas, to values. The same things have been named multiple ways. So it's very difficult for you to build a consistent data set and a search experience if you just copy everything as it is. So what we typically look into, advising to our clients as well, is to set enough time in a migration project to review the data, to come up with the target metadata schemas up front, so you can validate those against your future workflows and needs. Real production cases, not the dream scenarios, but real scenarios. Then when that is validated, then you can start normalizing the data, translating it from basically source A to source B, and move on. That said, there's a lot of value, of course, in the historic data as well. So we never suggest for you to kind of put down the drain your original data. There's also a great value we typically see to store the content together with our original metadata, for example, as a sidecar. But typically we do not recommend just copy-paste values which you don't know. As you already mentioned, there might be a lot of data which you just don't know what it even means. So there is no added value for that potential in your new archive. So primarily the focus should be, does this data helps me to find the content? Does this helps me with the rights management? Does this help me to produce content faster and do the storytelling much more easily than I'm currently doing? And if the answer is yes, then of course that data is worth keeping. Otherwise, it's probably not too relevant for your new archive. There's a lot of talks about AI in the market as well, how AI can help to, first of all, clean up the data, enrich the content, but AI is a good supplement to your schema. It's not a replacement. AI, at least as it stands today in the market, can't really replace your structured data. However, it can be a very good tool on adding on top additional metadata to help you with the content discovery.
Great. Okay. And Heidi, when we first started working together, one of the things we did from an IMG perspective was, because I was an editor and I'd spent my life being handed boxes by, production teams, and in that, on that, tape was a piece of camera tape with a scribble at a time code and something really important that happened then, or this was a game that had a certain resonance for whatever reason. I kind of felt that I didn't really want to let that information go, and just as Janis has very clearly said, that there is an opportunity to do that. So what we embarked on was we scanned the lid of the boxes, including any label and paperwork inside as well, and create a multi-page PDF that was saved alongside the asset. And what we did as well at the time, we did a file-based QC of the content as it was migrated. So also we had a good idea of the state it was in at its best when we actually managed, did that, which included a lot of what we were doing was optical analysis of the surface of the tape to understand, because the other thing when you're doing these kind of migrations is the tape you think is the master is actually probably the one that's been in and out of VTs all its life and spun up and down and ejected at random places, whereas the clone of it actually hasn't been touched at all, right, or the duplex. And the reality is that's the one you should be migrating, not the other one. And so having physical understanding of what the tape is, what life it's had, could actually guide you in that. And do you want to add any more? Is that
No, I think
fair?
we were saying that sort of the metadata is going to drive your storage strategy. That's what really, really drives it. So it's making sure that you retain the information that's critically important, and also what's the purpose of doing the digitization or doing your, is it an archive project or is it for futuristic monetization? Because if it's an archive, then potentially everything that's written on the box and all of those notes are important and should be retained because you're retaining it for preservation purposes. So it's all those sorts of things and really understanding how that sits. But we create a lot of sidecars, yes, for everything.
I was just going to say, like, the evolution of where an archive originates, and obviously the legacy formats are so important, but as you move the legacy formats and its place and location of storage, the enrichment of that metadata becomes just as valuable as well, because the search criteria for what someone needs to find an asset suddenly is exponentially more. So as Janis was saying, like the use of AI and even various different tools at the moment to enrich that metadata further, from a scene detection or a color or an object recognition and, you know, logos, these are all valuable search features that help you monetize your content quicker than it would have been just going through PDF schemas. They're all extremely valuable in the process, but as time goes on and that evolution moves, so does the evolution of the metadata with it.
Yeah. And we talked about the metadata that may or may not be with the physical asset once you migrate it. But there's other metadata around that currently is completely unassociated with that tape or with that file that's on that hard drive that hasn't been spun up for years. And that's potentially any sports data that was around at the time when that content was actually being recorded in a truck. The sports data was being created as a result. So, you know, Matt, in your world with Formula E, and Janis, you've seen this as well. Would you like to talk a little bit about how, you know, bringing together the potential that the actual sports data has?
Yeah, I think obviously the point of what we're all sitting here for is to enhance everybody's experience. And you might have things that you didn't know existed, or you might have things that, you know, further down the line will be able to help people not just find what they're looking for, but as you say, it's where can you put it further down the line that gives you can monetize and you can send off to get more money in for your content. And when it comes to the simple things of, you want to be able to search as an editor for something specific, you want to be able to do that as easily as possible, and if that exists, great. I think the other question is as well is, once you've brought that, after you've archived and you've brought this all up and you've put everything on a bucket, you can either ingest and then do your metadata afterwards, or it could be done in AWS, let's say, or it can be done beforehand and it goes in with this metadata already, and you're probably going to be finding how people actually search for things and what's needed from that schema as it goes along. And I think also the older footage that you have, it's going to have a little amount. How do you balance that out, and do you add more to that original stuff that might not have as much metadata compared to the stuff that's further down the line? And again, just to make it easier on, I guess, the end users' lives, who are mostly the editors or the APs who are actually the ones using these systems the most, is how can they save time, and I guess in the end is just build that efficiency, because they're not spending all of that time having to find things.
I think it's also important to state that in the MAM world, the sports data only adds value if it links to the video you have. Yeah. Especially these days, we live in the age of data, so there's so much data around. You can get so much statistics around all the events you have, but not everything is linked to the footage. So when we look at what is worth ingesting, I would strongly recommend for you to assess the sports data the same way as your core content. This is really important for you for long-term preservation. So basically, you can go back in your archive after many years and still find what you're looking for. So it's very important for you to kind of keep the stable taxonomy, to use stable IDs linked to your events, your matches, your players, and so on. So we typically, with our clients, when we work, we do advise for the clients also to translate all the sports data when they store with assets to their own schemas. So what I was saying about preparing schema for the assets, which you will use down the road, that also applies for the sports data. Because we see quite often in our industry as well, a client has changed data providers at least 3 times. So they have at least 3 types of sports data linked to their catalog, which is inconsistent completely. So when you do that data normalization during the migration, that's the golden opportunity for you to clean all this up and set yourself for success in the future.
And that's really important, that when it comes to data providers, what time base were they using? Were they using local time? Were they using UTC? You know, those JSONs will be completely full of time of some form or another. Certainly in tennis, we had match times. We had all sorts of different times. But in the move towards remote production and things like that, you've actually got potentially that the video files themselves were done in local time, either local event time or local time because the hub's in London, or like in Germany, like where your place is in Cologne. But and so this is, understanding how you're going to bring these things together is important. When it comes to legacy tape and file-based systems, before EVS really took over, tapes were actually, multiple tapes were used to record matches, so you had overlaps, right? So you've actually got assets which have got potentially quite considerable overlap of content in it too. So considering the impact that has on your process is always going to be very useful. I think overall, in terms of the metadata, rubbish in equals rubbish out. And so we've just got to be mindful that we try and clean this up, because the minute we want to strap AI over the top of any of this stuff, we're going to get a whole bunch of nonsense coming out of it. Otherwise, if we haven't cleaned it up, done our housekeeping properly. So we talked about the metadata, we talked about where it's all come from, but let's talk about the codec for a second, right? All of this stuff has been recorded on various sorts of files and formats and codecs over the years. Simon, what do we think about, should we care about the codec? Is native always best?
I think there's been a sort of history of people trying to create a mezzanine in-house and use something that can be then tangible to go up and down in scale with minimal effort. But truth be told, your assets should be able to be accessible regardless of what codec, file format and frame rate they're in. And that becomes more contagious down the line when you start having to sort of version control that. But I think you should be able to use your assets regardless in any form. There's obviously a heavy container load with that, because if you keep it in the highest resolution format, you're going to be looking at more storage volume, whether that be on-prem, hybrid, or in a cloud environment. That then starts to add on costs to that underlying cost that Heidi was saying earlier. Your archive then becomes an exponential P&L that you really have to consider. And as you start keeping those high res, because that's where it's going to be in the future, your overall costs are going to increase significantly. So it shouldn't matter, but truth be told, there is still a form factor that makes sense where it's in a compressed but resolute format, such as a HD, for example.
So anyone in the room, if I say VC3, does that mean anything to anybody? Yeah. So VC3 is actually a SMPTE designation of a particular codec. And what that is, there's a commitment by whoever created that proprietary codec at the time to make sure that archivally it will exist for the future. And there are certain codecs that various people in this room, I'm sure, and other people around the world, either in camera format terms or in VT record trains or file conversions, have created files that aren't actually compliant with that. And therefore, the danger is you could be storing a ton of files in a particular codec that you might struggle to decode it in the future in 20 or 30 years' time, right? And thinking ahead about some of this stuff is also going to be important about it. And to Simon's point, you've got that point. I used to always believe native was best. I was rigid about it because why would we put it through another codec thing? But then I suddenly started thinking, oh, hold on a minute, that stuff is in this wacky codec that came off a GoPro or something. And is it, in 20 years' time, is anyone actually going to be able to play this? They'll get the file, but how the hell are they going to actually see it? So thinking about that is going to be a real, should be part of everyone's thinking in all of this. And okay, so we've decided on codecs and we've got our stuff in, and we're now managing potentially systems that other people have built before us, and now we're managing that like we talked about when I first started talking about. Simon, you must have seen this a number of times. I mean, Brian, you remember the Rooney overhead kick? IMG, we did a search on Rooney's famous overhead kick goal in the archive, the Viz archive. Where's Andy? Here he is on the Viz RDOME that we had at the time. How many versions was it we came up with? It was a ridiculous number, 100 versions of exactly the same overhead kick, right? That was all being stored on LTO, duplicated, and off-site stored as well, and available in the nearline system, ready for in EVS or edits, right? Deduplication. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's certainly something that everyone is considering at the moment, if they haven't already. It's a bone of contention, and I think this has been escalated with remote production. You can have an asset coming into you, but you've got 6 different teams creating social, highlights, news, whatever it might be. They're all individual assets coming from the main, so you actually create identations of the same content, maybe in a different form, or maybe slightly snipped up differently. That duplication of data becomes just exponentially more cost to the business, harder to search, harder to index. It's just becoming a real problem. Deduplication is something that every business should have a house maintenance format for, and certainly a process for. But with this need for content going everywhere now in various different entities, from social to broadcast to news, this will still be an issue, and I think it just needs containment. It needs it's almost a team within a team. There won't be a budget for this, but every major broadcaster, sports rights holder, or anyone in that environment should make this as one of their mandated things to consider if they want any kind of level of understanding their archive further down the line. Because if you don't do it now, it's just become equally harder down the line.
And it's not always deliberate that this deduplication, problem happens. I mean, Brian, we were forever fighting the editors who never had any space in the Avid online storage, and we'd be banging onto the production managers to say, they've got to media manage better. This is the deadline. If you don't do it by then, we'll come in and do it for you. Do you know what they did? They just marked everything for archive, the whole lot. They just literally everything to archive, didn't it, Brian? And then the Ardo was taken up with tons and millions of rights that it was having to do. And then, the edit storage was suddenly clear, but oh my God, it just compounded this problem. So ensuring that the production teams themselves have that discipline anyway. But Janis, is there anything AI can do to help us in some of these areas, do you think?
Definitely. The AI technology has evolved quite a lot over the last years. So definitely when it comes down to identifying similar footage on the frame level, the technology is there. However, there are of course dedicated deduplication solutions which probably might be a better fit for this specific use case.
I think you also need to consider the environmental impact. And so I know that a lot of the organisations have got CSR budgets, and you can then look at how you could actually tuck something like deduplication. And there are some great vendors out there that actually offer that as a service, but actually to significantly decrease the carbon footprint that you're actually causing with your digital storage. And I think that there is a huge problem at the moment with the vast volumes of data that's being created and people not wanting to purge and get rid. But the knock-on impact of that on the environment is significant and shouldn't be underestimated either.
Yep. And to your point earlier on about ROI and costs, if you deduplicate, you're actually potentially storing a hell of a lot less, and it'll cost you less.
And I think the other thing, just wanted to add, I think everyone's concerned about, how you maintain that level of knowledge in that data. Production teams don't always stay with a company for long periods of time, 10 years or more. You might have them in a flux where they're actually rotating across different projects or different teams or different years. So the knowledge that goes with that, if it's not done at a maintenance level at the very early stage and it's just purged, like you say, someone's going to have to try and make sense of that nonsense beforehand, and it will drive them out of the business. There needs to be a level playing field of housekeeping and maintenance, and I think it's so key. I just never hear it enough when we're in conversations with customers. And don't get me wrong, I'm a storage vendor. I love to sell storage, but we do it sensibly. You keep your hot tier, which is just meant for your main core production, and you peer it off in a cheap, easy storage underneath. And we try and relay that message, but there are so many conversations where sports companies just go, no, we just want more of the same.
You must have heard this a million times, but my favourite phrase with edit storage in particular, there are two types of storage: new and full. And that's it. So, Matt, anything add to that?
I think there are instances where, let's say with Formula E, we had to pack up 3 hours after the race, and as soon as you recorded everything and you go, right, well, we need to get everything up to the cloud so that we have this available and we're not going to turn anything on again for 2 months for the next race. You have to make sure everything gets up there. Is there somebody who is physically going to be clicking the buttons to say, this has definitely gone up, this has gone up? How do you manage all of that? And also, yes, there might be other versions of things that are saved. Do they need to be stored in the same way, in a different way? Is that based on the system? Is that based on how the editors worked? Do you want to be able to link those edits, let's say, rather than create new assets of those edits and say, look, yes, this comes from clip A. We're not reduplicating clip A to create all the other things that are being made. You want to be able to do that, but also, again, you want to make sure you have everything. But it's a balance of managing that in the time frame that potentially you might not be able to do anything else with. And a lot of people are doing more remote productions, that they're renting out a facility for X amount of days and they need to be out by a certain time and everything has to be up or stored in a certain way. So I say it's balancing that at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, certainly in tennis, we get to the point the guys would pack up and actually the main storage that all the editors have been editing off at the time is now in a container on a ship. And we're not going to see it for like a month. So we're in a bit of trouble if those X files are corrupted, because who's checking those before they get yanked out and pulled, or is the stuff even on there in the first place? Those kind of challenges really affect everyone who's in that sort of global traveling circus world. So if we got our stuff stored and we're happy that we've got metadata in there and we believe it's now starting to search, we kind of have a MAM at that point, a media asset management system. Now, I'm not going to suggest, in my world, talk to me later at the bar and I'll tell you that there isn't one archive. I can't stand it when people come up to me and say, well, we'll talk to you about archive. Archive isn't one thing. Archive could be up to 4 different things when we've discussed about preservation and heritage. We've discussed about production asset management. We've discussed about archive itself in terms of long-term storage, and then there's commercial archive that you are using in terms of bringing in the dollars for your content, which is a more restricted set of availability. And then you've got the other asset management world of news, in sport particularly, news, highlights, that immediate event-based delivery stuff. So Pixitmedia, I had multiple systems that were running, and they were kept multiple for very good reasons, because I felt the use cases were all quite different at the time. But this idea of the MAM suddenly brings up this idea of, does all of the database and the metadata side of it need to be intrinsically coupled with the storage, such that if you go to a MAM provider, then you are literally stick all your stuff into their storage with their MAM over the top? Or do we think there's a new world coming? Janis?
Yeah, this is definitely a trend we see in the market as well. So there is more appetite for more hybrid solutions for our clients, not to put everything in kind of a one bucket together with a cloud vendor and expect that the cloud vendor will be up and running like we have seen recently. So there are more and more hybrid rollouts happening across the industry where first of all, of course, there is a use case for the long-term storage, the legacy archive, where people really are interested in preserving the value they have put into basically producing that content. So they want to have full ownership within their own data center or their own premises. So that's kind of their long-term archive storage for preservation. But also we see more distributed workflows. I think we'll talk a little bit later, a little bit about the near live workflows, which at least the technology is there to be able to distribute this in a more efficient way.
So bring your own storage. As a storage man, you'd be happy with that. You buy the storage from you guys, and then you bring whatever MAM to the show, whatever you do. You down with that?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, there should be a hybrid model in how you deploy your storage solutions as well, and how you integrate with the MAM, and not blowing our trumpet, but we have certainly integrated with many MAMs over the years because we recognize we're only part of the solution. An ecosystem and a chain of production environment, you become intrinsic, but only for a certain part, and the MAM adds more value and someone else adds more value. So be able to communicate that metadata, sharing, rehydrating, doesn't matter where the content resides after that, as long as there's a visibility of where that asset is, and ultimately the MAM can take that on. I think that's where value comes down the line, because Heidi sure has done cloud work as well, but actually putting your archive into a cloud environment and having maybe a DR on-prem or DR in the cloud, having that flexibility to move assets around, and where the asset then becomes valuable and where those services are to take it further, you can use the cost analysis. Usually a MAM can understand those boundaries, and so it can add a lot of value if it understands the intrinsic metadata and the value of the asset to begin with.
Matt? Sorry. Go on.
No, I think as I say, what you want from whatever you choose and however you want to do it is you want an editor, wherever they might be, whether that's sitting somewhere where all of the high-res files exist, but also they're in the cloud, or whether they're sitting at home. You want them to be able to access their footage, and you want them to be able to do that in the most efficient, effective, cost-effective way. But it's got to work at both ends at the same time. So they want to be able to pick up from one or the other and not be reliant on just the things being in the cloud, or just the things being, the content being where they're sitting and they're having that. And that's where, stereotypical hard drive-based workflows are stuck, where, where is the project? Where is the footage? You want to also be able to say to somebody else, well, I need the footage now, I'm going to download it from the cloud, but also carry on that project and work in that way. And how that might look is also then, do you want to go proxies? Do you work in high-res? Do you fully go in the cloud? Could you do something of like you just work on a virtual machine instead? The things that you can add to actually make sure that the editors are getting the most out of this system. Because then, as we say, by the end point, you'll have more content. You'll have more edits. They'll have more time to fine-tune these edits. The quality goes up, the output goes up, the efficiency goes up, but it's all got to work around in the same way. And it can't just be one idea that goes, here's what we're going to do, and that's it. It's sort of got to work with how it actually works with everybody and where they all might be.
So one thing I used to hear a lot when I was at AWS was okay, this is great. I can edit in the cloud. Let's have my content in the cloud, and that gives me that scope and capability to have global access into that content and work either at full res or at proxy. That's fine. But the one word that kept coming up with everyone's concern was egress. Matt, what's your view on egress?
Well, it's expensive if you do things wrong.
Yeah.
I think the aim is, again, you want to be able to access as much of your footage as possible, but when you think about the cost of it, proxies are such smaller files than a high-res file. Then you've got to think about how does that work in the background, and then it goes, well, let's say some of them that will let you render out using the cloud on a virtual machine, how much do those virtual machines cost? Yes, the egress might not be there because you're downloading from the cloud to the cloud and it's all being done in the background, but you also want, a lot of editors are very used to having everything there and having that ability to just be able to download the footage and just have everything there. Do you want to just eliminate everything and literally do everything in the cloud? But what, as we saw, what if it all goes wrong and you can't access that footage? You want to be able to, again, have a hybrid model of having the option to do that if you need to. I think a lot of companies as well, especially with sports, are doing is, they'll have deals with the cloud vendors that will let them, not necessarily have free money, but if that's not a fear and something that you could do, then great, you could probably do more with it. But if you're looking at it going, how can we save the money by not bringing all of our footage down, is something that you could look at with a lot of products that are out there, and there are a lot that can improve what you've already got. If you go with a certain MAM vendor, there's certain things like Lucid Link or Media Anywhere they could add on top of what you're already doing, where you might have less control with what's going on and people need to get used to it, but you're not bringing any files down, but still making editors think they're using the same workflows as they used to.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of this is around the mindset. We have a lot of companies who, of course, have well-established workflows they have been using for many years, and not everyone is kind of open to shuffle things too much around. So this is also when you migrate from one, for example, MAM vendor to another, especially when you enable more cloud-based workflow, you need to be open to review your internal workflows, how you work with the content. And that is something which, of course, we find complicated in some of the projects we have been dealing with. The company wants the latest, greatest cloud technology, but at the same time, they don't really want to change any of their internal workflows, which really limits their capabilities on using the scale which the cloud provides on the hybrid solution overall.
Yeah.
I think egress is a funny one because I think people are aware, and at the early stage journey, it's almost disregarded because they're not expecting large volumes of content. They're dealing with small, and it grows and it grows. And the conversations that we're seeing now is, 7, 8 years in, cloud has been fantastic for them. So flexible, dynamic, it's great. And then it gets to the point where someone in the business does the financial calculations and realizes year 7, year 8, those business growth has meant that their strategy and growth has gone with the cost. And no one factored in, I've now got to get 100 petabytes out of the cloud because actually we're going to do a cloud repatriation. We're going to come out. It's actually cheaper to go on-prem. But now we've got to think, hang on, we've got 100 petabytes in the cloud. That's 50 million egress on a good value. That's before I even think about my other services and the investment. And those sorts of conversations are now coming up. So egress initially, I think, is almost disregarded because it's so small. But the volumetric is where it really makes sense. And I think you've probably seen this in calculations as well, but if it's not considered, much like every cost, power, lighting, heating, all the rest of it, when you're doing a rack room, the same comes with egress. If it's not considered as a volumetric later down the line, it can really bite people.
But I think that applies for LTOs as well. I think that when
Absolutely.
people adopted LTO workflows, they never considered in 5-6 years' time that format's going to become redundant and you're going to have to do that migration. So it's egress in another version, really, because you have to do that migration to that latest iteration.
So true, yeah.
I think that no matter what way you look at it, digital storage is always going to be live and active and needs to be managed. It's not one and done. Once you've digitized and created that digital file, you need to have that constant strategy and budget for that down the line to actually manage that moving forward.
Now that sort of understanding that total cost of ownership, the perpetual nature of some of this is really super important to all of this too. And so I think there's a lot to be said in and around this. And don't forget as well understanding the wider benefits of cloud. I'll put my AWS hat on for the minute, but one of the big conversations were, okay, so there are way more other benefits to me being in the cloud that also add all sorts of value I never had before, and also potentially de-risk the operations that I've going. Things like, doing software updates and parallel runs and sandboxing of stuff very quickly and easily to actually help you move on. Especially if you've got a MAM system, you need to shut it down in order to do a software update, or you're in the middle of all your LTO drives have got to come out because you've now got to do a migration up to the next version of LTO. Those are painful places to go through. We're kind of out of time, unfortunately. I told you we should have. We're going to have to either do a podcast or we're going to carry on. But anybody, any quick questions or points raised so far? Yes, Tom.
Do you have any good examples of monetization of archive, like on scale, maybe also like in D2C areas?
I can provide that. We work with partners. We work with a partner that actually can provide that by vertical sector, and by market and by region. So I can, if you want to catch up after, I can provide you that. Yeah.
Cool. So there's plenty more to talk about. Unfortunately, we have run out. There was all sorts on security access, more AI stuff. I'm sorry we've run out of time a little bit, but I hope you've enjoyed this and it's been of some benefit. And thanks to our guests today, with Heidi, Janis, Simon, Matt, and thank you very much for being here.